Welcome to another edition of Precinct 444, Lifeline Officer Safety and Wellness. My name is Troy Anderson, Executive Director of Officer Safety and Wellness at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Today is a very exciting topic, sort of an investment strategy 101 for law enforcement officers around the country, looking at a number of different aspects, trying to pull together some really good tips and tools for your tool belt in order to be able to get yourself to a place where you can financially retire in what I might call good standing and be able to live long and prosper, to borrow a statement from a very, very good show from my youth. Today joining us is Scott Eason from MissionSquare Retirement. I'll tell you from the top that MissionSquare has been incredibly supportive of all of our efforts, and they are the single supporter of our Law Enforcement Ambassador Program, which is an exceptional program. And for active and retired law enforcement officers or dispatchers, I would encourage you to visit our website at nleomf.org and learn more about the Ambassador Program. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Scott, who's joining us. Scott, I'm going to go through your bio real quick, if you don't mind. It's pretty impressive. So I just want to share it with the group. Scott Eason, CFP, is a West Region Director for Financial Planning at MissionSquare Retirement. He leads a team of certified financial planner professionals focused on meeting the financial planning needs of MissionSquare participants. Mr. Eason has spent over 20 years specializing in public sector and law enforcement retirement, joining MissionSquare in 2019. So, Scott, today I'd like our discussion to really be focused on all level of folks that are listening to what we're doing today. And the reason I say that is because people around the country right now, finances are always a concern. But when you look at law enforcement, it's always one of those things, especially as law enforcement officers tend to retire earlier, it's even more significant and more important for them to really get some tips and tools, but not only that, but to really begin their investment strategy as early as possible. So, Scott, thank you again for joining us. And let's go through this tutorial, which I think will be very exciting. I know you're going to be working off a PowerPoint, which is going to be, I think, helpful for a lot of folks that maybe are driving along right now in their car and can't take notes as we're driving. And I don't encourage them to, but I would encourage them to go back and watch this both on our website and on YouTube as well. So, Scott, let's get started. Tell us about MissionSquare, because it's such a wonderful company with such a terrific mission, especially in light of supporting first responders.
So yeah, MissionSquare has been around for a little over 50 years. They are a not-for-profit corporation with the sole goal, the sole mission of helping public sector employees retire. That's really all we do. And so, of course, when you talk about, retirement, financial planning in general, you've got the general public. Everyone has there are certain things that apply to everyone. Mm-hmm. Then there are certain issues that are really specific to public sector. And really, if you take that even on another level down, there's a certain level of things that impact just law enforcement. There's certain considerations that are very unique to the law enforcement community. But so MissionSquare really focuses on that public sector, and a huge portion of our participants are, the law enforcement all across the country. And it's just really our honor to serve them. We serve those who serve our communities. So MissionSquare has been doing that for over 50 years, and I've been happy to be with them since 2019 and really enjoy the work that we do here.
That's great. All right, let's tear into this, because I was going over some of these slides earlier, and I'm going to follow along on my other monitor, because there is a wealth of information here. And even somebody like myself, who I always kind of prided myself on having at least a pretty good investment knowledge, I realize that there's still much more to learn, especially when we get to the annuity piece, because I will admit up front, I know little to nothing about annuities, and I think it begs a discussion, but I won't get in your way.
Sure. I mean, and again, the presentation is called Financial Planning Basics, right? How to set and achieve goals. So it focuses a lot on goals. It's a very general, basic backbone that we're going to be working with here, but on each one of the sections, we'll elaborate as to how that affects, public sector and then law enforcement. Again, it's almost like we're drilling down. There are certain things that do apply to everybody, and then we just take it down those other couple of levels. So, we're going to be talking about a lot of things, just generally setting goals and budgeting, an emergency fund and insurance, credit and investing, tax planning, college savings, and then retirement planning and even some estate planning. So, all of
Mhm.
these things are different parts of a financial plan, of financial planning, of your financial life. So they all impact where you're going to go. So when
Mhm.
we talk about that, we talk about what your goals are. It doesn't really matter where you are in your career. If you're just starting out, maybe that goal is, well, I want to make sure that I retire at 50, right? Maybe you're
Mhm.
already retired and that goal is, well, I want to make sure that I enjoy my retirement and I get to travel to visit the grandkids this often, or maybe I want to relocate to another state when I retire. So it's important to think about what you want to do in the future,
Mhm.
regardless of whether you're already retired or you're just getting started. We want to have those plans. And I'll tell you, when I had back in high school, I had a coach that said, if you have a goal, you have to write it down.
Mhm.
Anything, a goal that's not written down is just a dream. So I want us
Sure.
to have dreams, but I want us to, put those down, put them in writing, make sure that you know what you're working towards. So then you know if you're on track or not, right? That's, I think, a really important part of financial planning, of just thinking about retirement and all these things in general, is you want to know
Mhm.
where you're heading and are you on track or not. So, I know everybody has seen this before when we talk about goals, right? The SMART goals, talking about being able to measure it, right? A goal
Mm.
is specific. I want to retire at 50, right? That's a specific goal. A goal is measurable. Well, you can measure it by your age, or I need, $3,000 a month to live on, whatever those numbers might be. It needs to be attainable, right? We're not all going to be able to buy a 20-foot yacht. We want to make sure that it works. It needs to be relevant to your situation. And again, it needs to be timely. So when we talk about a long-term goal like retirement, if you're just starting in your career, maybe a 30-year savings is a long time, but those 30 years are going to go by faster than you think.
Yeah, they
And there
do.
could be a lot of shorter goals in there as well. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, we could be talking about getting an emergency fund. It could be saving for college, which sometimes is a shorter term goal than a retirement goal. So, it's also important that we have multiple goals. A lot of times people will say, oh, well, I'll start saving for retirement when I get done paying off my debt. I'll start saving for college when I get done with this or that. And that really can be a challenge because life happens and you may get behind on one of those other things and not end up getting on to the next goal. So it's more important to prioritize. Okay, I've got $100 a month to save. I'm going to put 50 of that 100 towards my retirement and 25 towards college and 25 towards an emergency fund or whatever it may be. So
Sure.
prioritizing those goals instead of trying to do them one at a time is also a really important tip to making sure that you're working towards all of your goals. So again, the SMART goals, we've all heard that before.
And I think part of that, Scott, is just staying committed to it. It's kind of like, we all know the people that we grew up with that said, oh, I'm going to take a year off after high school and then I'm really going to get to college. And then a year comes and I got a job, but I'm going to wait another year. And I think, I sort of view investing the same way. It's you have to make a decision and just stick to it and then work around that money that you've decided to invest. Keep that money invested and work around it. Continue to invest, but don't stop investing. You have to stick with it. I mean, it's a really long game. And I know that we're going to talk about that, but it's a long game.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that goes along with that is you have to revisit those goals and make updates, right? If you're
Mhm.
early in your career, you might say, all right, I'm going to start saving for retirement. I'm going to do $100 a paycheck. And that's
Sure.
great. But I can't tell you how many people I've talked to over the years that they're 10, 15 years in and they're still saving that $100 a paycheck that they started with, 10 or 15 years ago.
Hmm.
So other important parts of that is to go back and revisit your goals, see where you are, and then make adjustments. It's not enough to just say I'm going to start saving. You also have to be committed to increasing those savings as often as you can.
Hmm.
Typically, if you get a raise, make sure that you bump up your savings a little bit to go along with that. Because proportionally, if you were saving $100 a paycheck every year when you get a raise, you're saving less and less if you don't also increase that along with it, right? Now
Yeah,
you don't have to put your whole raise into your retirement savings, but if you get a raise, give your retirement a raise too, right? And we've all heard that pay yourself first philosophy. That
sure.
really does matter. It makes a difference.
Absolutely.
So let's just touch on some of the basics like budgeting, right? We've all got income and expenses. So that income, your paycheck, if you're already retired, it could be benefits. It could be Social Security, it could be a pension, it could be rental income. You could get some interest or income from other investments. And then we all have our expenses, right? There's our fixed expenses like our mortgage or our rent.
Hmm.
If we're in really good shape, maybe if the house is paid off, so it's just the property taxes that are the fixed expenses, and then the discretionary expenses, the fun stuff. Now, I always put it this way, when we talk about stuff, we all, when we're working, we spend, 40 hours or maybe even more every week working. And then we do the fun stuff on the weekends and when we're off. Well, when we're retired, we have an extra 40 hours or more a week to do stuff.
Right.
And I always say it like this: stuff costs money. So I
It
want to
does.
make
Yeah.
sure that, my income and my expenses now, I expect those to be pretty similar in retirement. A lot of times you hear, oh, well, you need 75% of your working income to retire comfortably. You need this or that. Well, they've done some studies, and actual retired folks, the first year of their retirement, are actually spending 105% or more of what they
Mhm.
were when they were working. And I put it like this: you wouldn't want to take a 10, 15, or 20% pay cut now. Why would you
Right.
want to take that pay cut in retirement, right? So I
Sure.
always say the goal should be to walk out the door when you retire with the same as what you were making when you were working or more. It's even better if you could get a raise in retirement. But I mean, you're living on a certain level of income.
Mhm.
Some expenses may go away when you retire, but some new expenses may come on. And again, we'll talk about this a little later, but especially if you're retiring younger, like law enforcement often does, there's certainly some expenses that go in there between 50 and 62 that a lot of that folks that retire later may not even have to worry about. So
Mhm.
again, keeping on track of your budget, making sure that that your discretionary expenses are reasonable. The other thing that I'll say in here when we talk about saving, over the 20 plus years that I've been doing this, I've seen the same illustration over and over again. Make your coffee at home, and, and don't go out to the expensive coffee places. And
Sure.
that'll save you. It used to be, whatever, $3 or $4 a day. Now I mean, it could be $10 for a cup of coffee, depending on where you go. And that does add up. We call that the small sacrifices example, right?
Mhm.
But I think in 2025, it takes a little more than a small sacrifice to have a big return over your lifetime, right? So we have to prioritize our future just as much as we prioritize today. And so sometimes it takes more than skipping a cup of coffee, right? Sometimes it takes significant adjustments to
Mhm.
lifestyle, again, depending on where you are in your career and what your situation is. So I want it to be clear that it's not always as easy as skipping a cup of coffee. And again, public sector employees often have a pretty solid pension. Not always, but often. Uh, you know,
Mhm.
um, some public sector employees in law enforcement pay into Social Security, and some don't. Now, with the recent pass of the Social Security Fairness Act, that is a game changer for a lot of public sector employees who previously would have been subject to windfall elimination and um, and the government pension offset. So that's going to help. But still, you may not be paying into Social Security, so it may not have as much of an impact as you might think if you're not paying into that system. So
Right.
understanding all those different sources of income in retirement can be important in making sure that your spending is appropriate for your situation, right?
Yeah, I think it really falls under that adage that you hear so often now: get the hard work out of the way early in your life, and the latter part of your life should be easy. But if the early part of your life is easy and you're taking shortcuts, the end of your life is going to be hard. And I don't know many people that aspire to be working in their 70s in an entry level position just simply to keep food on the table, especially when you look at the sacrifice that so many law enforcement make across this country every single day: the time away from their family, the shift work, the holidays, the inclement weather, the exposure to traumatic events. That is cumulative stuff. And I mean, I look at so many folks that I worked with over the years in law enforcement and really wish them a rich and robust retirement. And unfortunately, not a lot of people put that early work in that they should have, and they relied simply on the fact that there would be a pension or eventually, as we'll talk about, Social Security. But the reality is, even with your pension, which is going to be a fraction of what your salary has been, and we know many law enforcement officers that sort of live beyond their means to some extent and have the opportunity for overtime that will not be there in your retirement. So I think cops need to be thinking about it's a paradigm shift. They need to really change the way that you think And I know before I retired, I got very accustomed to having some overtime jobs every now and then. And then suddenly when that's gone, uh, where are you going to go to? You're either going to have to get another job or you're going to rely on exactly what we're talking about today, which is that hard work that you put in by making more sacrifice and investing money into an account that'll pay you for a lifetime down the road if you do it appropriately, for sure.
Right. And again, typically the overtime isn't included in the pension, right? You're
Right.
getting a portion of your base salary, but if you're used to working a good amount of overtime, you know, uh, if you then go, even if you got 100%, you're still getting 100% of your base salary, which wasn't what you were living off of. So
Right.
again, that's where it comes to, if you're saving appropriately and you're making all these plans, hopefully your income is higher, really, to help make up for some of that overtime that you might have grown accustomed to. So and so, like just like what you were saying, you do the hard work early. If you start saving early and you do those increases, you eventually get to the max, and it just becomes part of your expenses, right? It's you consider it a fixed expense and you don't notice it. Once you get to it's hard to get up to the maximum level of savings, like in a 457. I mean, which is over $20,000. I mean, it's a lot that you can save,
Mhm.
and you can get some tax breaks for it, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the sooner you get there, the easier it is to stay there, right? And like you said, you earlier said, you take a year off before going to school. Oh, well, I had a couple of things come up, so I'm going to lower my savings for a little bit. It's really
Mhm.
hard to get back to it, right? So, having that commitment and kind of thinking ahead and doing it the soonest you can, really does make a big difference.
It sure does. And that's why I suggest that it really is a change in mindset. You really have to, you have to sort of reconcile in your own mind that I need to do this. This isn't I want to or I should. I need to do this for my future because none of us know what tomorrow brings, or even if there is a tomorrow. But there's a reason why people purchase life insurance, right? You're purchasing insurance that you'll never see the result of, which seems strange that we do that, I know, but that's really what this is. This is your financial life insurance to some degree that you're going to be able to draw off of. And if you don't have that nest egg there, there's a cruel reality on the other side when you're trying to make ends meet and the bills are still coming in and you're trying to live off a retirement pension if you are fortunate enough to have one. And I think, Scott, as you know, we've seen a number of departments around the nation, whether it's state, county, municipal, city, who just simply have run out of funds and it's not sustainable. And they have, to some degree, many of them have collapsed and they've withdrawn. And some of them I know have offered is sort of an ancillary benefit to get into something else, perhaps, but not the retirement that I think many folks in prior generations in law enforcement were accustomed to. So, if you're fortunate to have it, good for you. And if you're not, here's your opportunity to create your own pension and figure out how to navigate through these waters.
Yeah, it's very true. Today you are responsible for a greater portion of that than you used to be, right? The pensions are a little bit lower. You have to work a little bit longer to get them, generally speaking. And so that just means you need to offset that with a little more savings than maybe the previous generations needed to do to get to the same level of income. And I like that you mentioned, kind of the insurance, the risk management, right? The first
Mhm.
step of that is just kind of having that emergency fund so you don't have to stop saving in your retirement if something comes up unexpected. They've done some studies that, like the average American can't handle a very small unplanned expense,
Uh,
and that's pretty scary when you look across the country. It doesn't take much for an average person to hit some pretty hard times. So, make sure that you have a little bit of an emergency fund there. Sometimes they say, a couple of months salary, socked away that way. If you could, if something minor comes up or something major comes up, you can cover it before you have to really start going into other sources like borrowing from your retirement or cashing things out even worse. So
sure.
making sure that you have an emergency fund. But as we kind of look at all the different ways that we manage risk, right? That's just kind of the first one. I've got a little bit of money set aside for a short-term unexpected expense. But then we talk about all the other things, right? When you're working, health insurance is typically covered by your employer, but that's one of the most important ones for law enforcement because if you retire at 50, if some folks, you'll actually get as a retirement benefit, have some health insurance coverage through your employer, even in retirement. And that's a fantastic benefit.
Hmm.
But again, those kind of benefits aren't as uh, common as they used to be. So you may have to pay your own health insurance from 50 until 65 when you qualify for Medicare, right? That's,
Hmm.
15 years of health insurance can add up quite a bit. So same thing. Hey, I'm exactly on track to walk out the door at 50 with exactly the same income that I had. Oh, but now I have to pay for my health insurance that was included in my salary before, right? So these things apply regardless of where you are. You want to make sure that you're thinking about those things. Of course, we have to have our car insurance, property insurance for your home and your belongings. But like you mentioned, Troy, life insurance, it's not for me that I buy life insurance, right?
Right.
It's for the spouse, it's for the kids, it's for the others that you want, that you take care of while you're alive. You want to make sure if something unexpected happens to you, that they're still going to be taken care of. So again, a lot of times life insurance is included in part of your employment.
Hmm.
And then when you get to retirement, you may need it or you may not, depending on where you are. If you've got plenty of savings in your 70s, maybe you don't need to have the life insurance because it does tend to get more expensive as you get older.
You bet it
But
does.
certainly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I said, you bet it does. I know because I'm at that point where it's about time for me to get a new one, and it was a lot different than when I purchased it in my early 30s.
Right. Yeah. And again, there's different kinds of life insurance and there's different things that are appropriate for different people. And so, I'll just take a moment and kind of mention, generally speaking, right? You got your term life insurance. You pay for a term of time, whether it's a 10-year term, a 1-year term, a 30-year term. But at the end of that term, first of all, you may not qualify to renew because your health may have changed. And it's going to be more expensive at the end of that term, whatever the term is. So then there's other kinds of insurance that are called permanent insurance, but you've got a whole life policy, a universal life policy, where essentially you're paying the premium for your insurance, but then a portion is also going into either a fixed account or an investment, depending on the kind. There's fixed and variable whole life and fixed and variable universal life. And those are considered investments and life insurance. And
Hmm.
obviously, you want to make sure that you understand the risks of all those things. Um, but then, that couldn't help the insurance to last longer because of that insurance or investment portion of it. But obviously, you're putting more in, right?
Right.
You're gonna pay more all along the way. But then once you get to where you would have had that 30-year term would expire and you have to start over, well, maybe you can't afford it at all. With the
Right.
permanent policies, maybe you don't. But again, you don't. Not everybody needs permanent insurance. Not everybody needs life insurance, depending on where they are in their career, in their situation. So
Sure.
again, everybody needs to be aware of what their needs are and what they need to cover. And then as we look on, right, you've got the liability insurance in case somebody trips onto your driveway, right? You want to make sure you're covered for that. But another two, the last two here on the list are really important, especially while you're working, right? Your disability insurance. I think
Right.
again, when you talk about a job as physical and demanding as law enforcement, disability is a higher risk than the average person. So therefore, that's more important than the average person on the street. You want to make sure that if something happens unexpected, that the disability is going to be there to cover you until you get to the next stage. When we talk about in retirement, you talk about something else that's important, and then that's long-term care, right? Generally speaking, people are living longer. And a lot of times we need a little help as we get older, and that can be very, very expensive. So again, as we're looking at all of the things that we're planning for, oh, everything's great. I walked out the door. I retired with all exactly the same income as I had when I was working. Oh, but 15 years into it, I start to need a little bit of help. Maybe I get Alzheimer's or I just need some assistance in my day-to-day life.
Hmm.
That can be very expensive. So
Very.
long-term care insurance is something to consider. And just like life insurance, though, the older you get, the more expensive it is. If you have any pre-existing conditions, it starts to get expensive. And at some point, you get to a point where you can't even buy that kind of insurance. So these are things that you want to consider earlier in your life, because the earlier you talk about anything that's health related, the cheaper it's going to be. Because unfortunately, our health doesn't get better as we get older. I wish it did,
Scott,
right?
it sounds like retirement is expensive right now, doesn't it? Especially with all these insurances.
Yeah, and again, these are the things that people don't think about because oftentimes new expenses that they didn't really consider. You don't think about long-term care when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s. It's not something you really think about until you're probably in your 70s or 80s. But when you're in your 70s and 80s, isn't the time to start trying to buy long-term care insurance, right? It's going to
Yeah.
be cost prohibitive if you can even get it. So,
And
so yeah,
anybody who's had a relative who has had to go and get full-time, long-term, care in one of these facilities, the cost is astronomical.
it
Very,
really
yeah. It's
is.
especially if you're paying out of pocket. So it's good to take these things into consideration and have this as part of the discussion, because I know that as I was nearing retirement, there were things that I factored, but many of these things I didn't, certainly not disability or long-term healthcare insurance, right? So I think it's important not only to understand what they are, but what your options are. So as you're going into retirement, you can think, wow, maybe I'm going to have to work a little longer in order to get myself to a place financially where I'm able to afford some of these insurances without having to go pick up an additional income.
Look, I mean, again, when we're talking about insurance in general, there are many, many people that the only reason they're working today is for health insurance, right? If they didn't need to pay for the
Mhm.
health insurance, everything else would be, they would have enough to support their normal lifestyle. But
Sure.
the health insurance is such a big expense that they're working just for that. So again, if you're thinking about that and planning for it, then maybe you can retire when you want to because you've thought ahead and planned for that extra cost of the health insurance or long-term care or whatever it might be.
Sure. Yeah, that has
So
definitely become a lot more common for sure.
yeah. And so that's kind of risk management. So let's swerve a little bit here and talk about really wherever you are in your career, but probably mostly early on in your life. We talk about credit, right?
Mm,
You want to live by your means. Well, we're not in a cash society where you don't buy it until you can afford it. I'm sure again, a couple generations ago, you didn't buy a new car until you saved up and you went and paid cash for the car. Uh, uh, Probably the only thing that they borrowed for was the home, and of course,
mhm.
homes were a lot less expensive
A couple
but they
thousand
still
dollars.
would have a mortgage. But so, we want to make sure that we're using credit wisely. We don't want to get overextended.
Right.
Credit is very easy to come by. Right now, it's also a little more expensive than normal because interest rates are a little bit higher. But so just make sure that you have the right capacity. You're not overstepping, um, and you're not really overextending yourself because it can be very easy. Again, if you don't have that emergency fund and then you have an unexpected expense and then,
Mhm.
you max out the credit cards and then something extra happens, then you can easily, get yourself into some trouble. And, more so than ever, those credit scores affect all parts of life. It can affect getting a job. It can affect renting an apartment. Not to mention the interest rates that you pay on the things that you do borrow for. So
Mhm.
make sure that you're paying attention to that. I won't spend a lot of time really talking about credit, but it can have an impact, a long-lasting impact if you get behind on things. So I'll tell you again, just a personal note. When I was very young, some of the folks that I worked with uh, didn't manage their taxes very well and ended up having some issues and messed up their credit. And I
Mhm.
kind of saw that and I'm like, oh wow, I don't ever want to do that. And so I've very meticulously taken care of my credit score over my life. But it's important. It really is important. And it can open a lot of doors if you have a good credit score. But if you get in trouble, it can also be a very serious detriment. So do pay attention to what you're borrowing and make sure that you don't get overextended.
Yeah, and once it goes south, it's not something you correct overnight. It is a long-term battle to get back to the top of the hill.
Right. And so that goes right into just debt in general, right?
Hmm.
When you're borrowing, with a credit card or a mortgage or a car loan, right? That is debt. And there's different kinds of debt. There's, here it says secured debt and unsecured debt, right? So secured, your mortgage or your car note, right? You don't pay it, they're going to come take your car. If you don't
Hmm.
pay it, they're going to kick you out of your house, right? That's secured debt. Unsecured is your credit card, right? You went and ate dinner and put it on the credit card. Well, they can't come repossess that dinner, right? That's unsecured debt. And so typically, an unsecured debt might have a slightly higher interest rate. Um, when you talk about like your mortgage, you can get some tax deductions for it, right? So there's different benefits and different costs to
Hmm.
different kinds of debt. So it's not all debt is created equal, but you always want to think about how much you're borrowing what's the term? It's a 30-year mortgage. Am I doing a 15-year mortgage? Am I paying it once a month? Am I paying it every 2 weeks? How am I paying these things back? And then what's the interest rate? And interest rates really matter. I mean, it's amazing the difference in interest rates. Just, it wasn't even 5 years ago where interest rates were the lowest they've been in my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And then now they're, relative, and they've come down a little bit, but they're compared to 5 years ago, they're extremely high. Overall, the long term, they're, a little bit higher than average, right?
Yeah,
So, you know,
sure.
paying attention to where the rates are and timing can matter on things. And maybe it is the time where you want to go old school and save up a little bit more before you go buy something. Maybe put a larger down payment so you borrow less, or even pay cash for a used car instead of financing a new one. So every
Mm-hmm.
situation is different, but you want to be aware of what you're doing as you move in. So as we move on from debt, we'll go the other way, right? Now we're talking about saving or investing. And people think about it differently. If you're putting money under the mattress, right? Well, there's no risk that the bank's going to go out of business because it's under the mattress, but there is a risk that the house burns down, right? So,
Right.
I want to say this as we talk about investing and before we get into risk in general, right? There is no way to eliminate risk. You can only trade one risk for the other, right? So, you want to make sure that you are thinking about risk, but let's talk about investing for just a moment, right? You don't also, it doesn't have to be as safe as sticking it under the mattress or always putting it in a savings account at the bank. It also doesn't have to be as speculative as cryptocurrency, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
whole range of different places where you can invest or save your money. And if you're doing it through like an employer plan, like a 457, or an individual plan, like an IRA, those are retirement accounts. You could certainly just get a brokerage account and invest directly into stocks and bonds and all these different kinds of investments. It's just important to make sure that you are aware of the risks. And what you want to do is you want to try to get a higher rate of return on some of that money so that you can stay ahead of inflation, and that money is going to grow for you over the years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about investing, this is where you say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? And again, especially today, because eggs are really expensive. So you don't want them all in one basket. You certainly don't want to drop it. But you want to have diversification, right? You want to make sure that you have different types of investments in your portfolio. And so, uh, I've always kind of said it like this: if you had just one thing, it's probably not the right thing, right? It
Mm-hmm.
would be nice if you had the crystal ball and you could always pick what was going to be the best investment for the year, but we can't do that. So we want to spread our risk around, just like the insurances we're talking about. We may put some money in a savings account. We may put some money in, a long-term bond account or a government bond account that's got a little bit of safety to it, but will pay a little bit more than a savings account. And we may
Mm-hmm.
want to put some in stocks. And there's lots of different kinds of stocks too. There's large companies in the US, the S&P 500 has been doing very well for quite a long time. There's international companies, there's small companies and medium companies, and you can get into specifics of technology companies and medical companies, and so you can diversify as much as you want, but the more broadly you're diversified, the less impact individual sections of the market will have on you, right? So you
Right.
just want to make sure, and I'm going to go to the next slide here, that you understand the risk and reward trade-off, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we're taking more risk, we expect that we're going to make more money. But is that guaranteed? It's not, right? I mean, again, that's the whole point is, and sometimes we get a little used to it. The stock market's been doing pretty well for quite a long time. We very quickly forget the last time the market went down, right? When we
Mm-hmm.
have a period of a bad market, it feels terrible, and we also very quickly forget that historically the market has always recovered, right? When the
Right.
market's bad, it feels really bad. But what things that we know is that when it's going up, we forget that it ever went down. So we're always surprised when the market goes down. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like it's the first time it's ever happened, and it's not.
Sure.
But the other studies about just human behavior, the pain of loss is greater than the euphoria of reward, right? It's and almost double, right? So if you had $100 and you lost 25, you have to make back 50 before you feel better, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, the pain of that loss just sticks with you. And so what that really does though is when we have a bad time in the market, people feel a little more risk averse, and they tend to then be maybe a little too conservative, and they miss out on some of the growth. And then the
Hmm.
reverse is true too. Things are going great. People forget that the market ever goes down. They get a little more aggressive than maybe they should be. So when we
Right.
do have a market downturn, it affects them more.
Right.
So again, it's important to understand what is your time frame, right? How do you feel about risk? How are you going to handle the ups and downs of the market? And what would you do if the market were to go down? If you've
Hmm.
got 20, 30 years before retirement, you probably can handle some pretty good ups and downs. But if you're already retired, you have less of an ability to absorb impacts in the market, or even worse, oh, I'm retiring in 2 years. Well, gee, if we have two back-to-back bad years, that's going to make it really difficult to retire on your schedule, right?
Right.
So normally speaking, the farther away from retirement you are, the farther away from spending the money you are, the more risk you can handle, and you typically lower that risk as you get closer. But that's just talking about the time frame. You then have
Sure.
to put how you personally feel about risk too. Some people are just risk averse. They like to wear a belt and suspenders at the same time, right? They don't do well with risk. And some
Yeah.
people are, just comfortable with it, and they're like, it's always going to be fine. So maybe we want to be somewhere in the middle, right? We want to find the right amount of risk for us and our situation. And again, talking to a financial planner can help understand what your risk levels are and help make
Sure.
sure that your investments are appropriate for your goals.
So, Scott, if I were to call you and I was a 25-year-old officer, are you going to take all of these things that we just talked about into account when we are looking at my long-term goals? Is this all going to play a factor?
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. The short-term goals and the long-term goals, the budget today, how much you're spending, how much you can afford to save, all of that. Like I said, it's about prioritization. Sometimes, I can only afford to save $100 a paycheck. Okay, so let's talk about where that should go and help you make that decision. Like I said, I'm going to prioritize. Well, I've got my kid I want to send to college, so that's a priority because it's a little closer. So I'll do 50 of the 100 towards that, and then I'll do the other 50 towards my retirement because I've got plenty of time for that, right? It
Right.
might be, oh man, you know what? I'd let my credit get a little away from me. So out of that $100, I'm going to pay 50 towards the credit and 25 towards college and 25 towards my retirement, right? Every situation,
Right.
we have to put together a plan. So the same thing, the college savings, the investments for that is going to be different because the time frame is shorter than
Hmm.
the retirement savings because the time frame is longer. So we'll talk about risk and reward and how how much you can handle on that and adjust it. And again, and it goes on depending on where you are, right? At some point we want growth, at some point we want income, at some point we want stability, kind of all of those things. And that looks a lot like the old three-legged stool, right? And we
Hmm.
talk about normally if you say, where does retirement money come from? Well, it's going to come from a pension if you have one. It's going to come from Social Security if you qualify for it. And then if you don't have those two, the rest is going to come from your personal savings, which is probably a retirement account through your employer. It might be an individual retirement account, or it could be from, just other money that you saved outside of retirement accounts. We'll talk
Right.
about retirement accounts are probably a little bit better than a non-retirement account for retirement savings, but it's important to understand that not everybody has a pension. A
Hmm.
lot of people that have pensions maybe aren't paying into Social Security. So, and I'll take a moment just to talk about Social Security right here. The way Social Security calculates your payment is they average your highest 35 years. So if you worked somewhere else before you joined law enforcement and you paid into Social Security for at least 40 quarters, which is 10 years, will you then qualify for a benefit?
Hmm.
But then they're going to average your highest 35 years. So if you only work 10 years in the private sector and then you went into law enforcement and then you don't pay into Social Security anymore, you're
Hmm.
still going to get a check from Social Security when you get to 62 or 67 or 70, depending on when you start getting it. But it is based on an average of your highest 35 years. And if you only
Right.
paid in for 10, they're going to average in another 25 zeros, which is going to bring that number down quite a bit. So,
Hmm.
although windfall elimination used to reduce it, also a big reason why a lot of law enforcement get a lower Social Security check is they're averaging in those zeros because they weren't paying into the system.
Sure.
And again, and there are some agencies that do pay into Social Security, which is great because now with windfall going away, you'll get your full Social Security benefit. If you have a pension too, you get your pension and, whatever that you saved along with that. So, there's a lot of different sources of income. Maybe you have rental properties, maybe you do some consulting work. There's a lot of different places where the income can come from in retirement, but we want to make sure that we're paying attention to those.
So what I'm hearing from you is that the listeners, the officers that are out there right now that are in their own mind thinking, I need a little guidance, I need a little direction because maybe I have been a little bit behind the curve on this one. They don't need to have the financial investment knowledge of Warren Buffett. They need to call Scott Eason or somebody on Scott's team who has that level of knowledge because you've already done the downfield blocking. You've done the hard work. You understand, and you've probably done this countless times with other people and really demystified the, sort of there's so much to learn. And I think we've just sort of scratched the surface here, but there's so much to learn. And I frankly don't know many officers who either have the time nor ambition to go and take, and take out these investment books for dummies and sit there and pore over them for weeks or months at a time in order to finally make some sense of this. So I guess this falls under the category of you don't need to reinvent the wheel when there are people that specifically do this for a living and have years of success doing it. So if that puts anybody at ease, and I certainly hope that it does, I know a lot of people are afraid to get into this because they just don't know where to start, right? They just don't know. What is the first step, Scott? What do I do today? I'm listening to this. I'm in my car. I have some money in the bank. I've been a cop for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But I have definitely been behind the curve. I've been factoring in my mind about relying probably too much on my pension if I have one. And I've been really romanticizing the idea about Social Security, but I'm a little bit scared because every time there's a new election, we talk about the viability of Social Security and how long this may be around. So if I'm that person, I'm listening right now, where do I start, Scott?
So here's the absolute shortest version of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Save as much as you can, invest as aggressively as you can handle,
Mm-hmm.
right? Increase it as often as you can, right? And try to get the best tax breaks that you can. I mean, that's the shortest version of it. And the real short version is save as much as you can, right? So,
Right.
you may need to look at the budget and take a look at that, but let's talk about how the taxes impact that, right? Because the more that you save, the better. But if you're saving like in a tax deferred or a pre-tax account, it can actually even feel easier. So, most retirement accounts, right? Whether it's an IRA or a Roth IRA or a 457 or a 401k or a 403b, all these different retirement accounts, when you put that money in, you're not going to pay taxes until you take the money out in retirement, right? So it grows tax deferred. And we'll look into an example of that in a moment. But so that gives you some tax breaks along the way. If you're investing in a typical IRA, a traditional 457, most people put that money in what's called pre-tax. So again, just to keep it easy, if you're in a 25% tax bracket and you save $100, it's only going to feel like $75 out of your pocket because you didn't have to pay income tax on that 25,
Right.
which is pretty nice. So you put that $100 out of your paycheck, which feels like $75 out of your pocket. It then grows tax deferred until you're ready to spend it in retirement. But then you pay income tax on whatever you spend in retirement, right? That's a traditional retirement account. So then you get the Roth style, right? So a lot of places have Roth 457s available. A lot of people do individual Roth accounts. Roth is you put in after tax money. So when I put that $100 in a Roth, whether it's a 457 or an IRA, I don't get a tax break today. $100 feels like $100. But over the years, that money grows. And then when I take the money out of a Roth account in retirement, I don't have to pay any income tax on it at all. So all the growth is tax free. Now, Roth has some extra rules, right? 59 and a half rule applies to Roth, and there's a 5-year minimum of the account having to be open. So there's some extra details with that, but tax breaks are important. A moment ago, we were talking about not putting all your eggs in one basket, diversifying your investments. The same can be said of your taxes, right? It would be nice to get some tax breaks today. It would be nice to get some tax breaks in retirement. So, some people will have traditional and Roth accounts, and maybe they save to both. If you're just starting out and, really it's tough to save, Pre-tax might be the way to go because you get the tax break today. It feels easier to save.
Hmm.
Later on in your career, you may get to a point where, okay, I can afford to save a little bit better now. So I'll do the Roth so I can get some tax-free money in retirement too. So, again, you have all of these different choices. You're going to look at what's most important. If I'm struggling to save, I need my tax break now. If I'm
Hmm.
doing all right and I can afford to save after tax, I'll get a great tax break at the end. So, we'll always look at those different options. And
Yeah.
here's the example,
Okay.
right? So, if you're taking $10,000 invested and it grows at 6% and you're in a 24% tax bracket, right? Over the course of 30 years, that $10,000 is going to grow to 57,435. And if you had been just saving that along the way and paying taxes as you go, you'd only have $38,000 in the account, right?
Mhm.
38,104. So a huge difference in letting that grow tax deferred. So even if you took all the 57,000 out after that 30 years, you'd still end up with $43,651 in your pocket after taxes. So
Mhm.
paying the taxes later is better than paying them along the way, right?
And when you're in retirement, I mean, presumably, and maybe I shouldn't make this assumption, but you, in all likelihood, may be in a different tax bracket. Does that
Yep.
impact this at all?
It absolutely can.
Mhm.
Although, again, if we're doing what we want and we walk out the door with the same income that we had when we were working, maybe we're not in the same tax. Maybe we
Right.
are in the same tax bracket.
Or
Maybe we're in a higher bracket if we planned really well and we've got all these different sources of income. But that's another reason why like diversifying your tax status helps, right? If
mm,
I'm in the same tax bracket, but I've got Roth income that comes out tax free, that gives me access to money that's not going to increase my taxes in that year. So,
sure.
you know, taxes, when I became a certified financial planner, right, we have to study on several different disciplines, right? We have to understand estate planning and long-term care insurance planning and retirement planning and investment planning. But tax planning is a big part of it. Now, again, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a tax professional, I don't give tax advice, but I have to understand how all of these things are impacted by taxes. And I've heard
Mm.
it said that financial planning, the exam that you have to take to become a certified financial planner, they said it's a tax exam with some investment questions. But again, we have to understand all those different things. But taxes run through everything there is when we're talking
Mhm.
about finances.
Okay.
So again, let's talk about you asked just a couple slides ago, what should a uh, somebody who's brand new, what should they do? And I said save as much as you can. The sooner you get started, the more you're going to have, right?
Mhm.
So this just shows an example of somebody saving $3,000 a year, growing at 6%. You start at 20, you save $3,000 a year. By the time you're 65, there's 679,000. So close to $700,000 from 20 to 65. If you wait till you're 35, it drops all the way down to 254,000. If you wait till you're 45, it's only 120.
Mhm.
What I don't want to say there is, oh shoot, I'm already too old, it's too late. It's never too late, but the sooner the better, right?
Right.
So regardless of where you are in your career, the sooner you start, the more you save, the better. To me, this is that old question, when's the best time to plant a tree? 30 years ago. When's the
Sure.
second best time? Today.
Right.
So, if you haven't started, start. And if you've already started, save a little bit more, right? It all goes together. The more you save, the better. The earlier you start, the better. But it's going to really have an impact over time.
And just to keep that in perspective, as we look at this graph, I mean, we're talking essentially this saving $50 a week. That's really what this boils down to, right? When we're looking at these numbers.
I mean, yeah, $3,000
Right.
a year. It
Yeah.
really, and again, if you're doing it pre-tax, it's not even going to feel like $50, right? So
Right.
feel like 37. So the more you save, the better. When you're getting the tax breaks, it makes it feel a little bit easier. Um, it's just really key to make sure that you're saving. And again, this shows somebody working till 65. Remember, if you're planning to retire at 50 or 55, that's a double whammy, right?
Mhm.
You're retiring sooner, so you have less time to make that money grow. And then you're probably living longer in retirement because you're retiring younger. So the money has to last you longer. So again, when we talk about things that are specific to law enforcement, your savings period is probably shorter. Your retirement period may be longer than
Sure.
average. So that means you probably want to save a little bit more because you've got less time to do it.
Yeah, I tell this story. I worked with a coworker for years, and he would go out and just simply work one overtime job every week. He would work one overtime job a week that was specifically just to put into his retirement account. And, let's just say it was maybe when he was earlier in his career, he made $200 for that. Maybe by the end of his career, that was a $500 shift. But that shift just specifically went for investment. And by the time he retired, I think he had 1.4 million dollars in this account that he had saved over his entire 30-year career or something, and ended up with a substantial nest egg on top of that traditional pension, and of course with the forethought of looking towards Social Security. So he found himself in a sweet spot. I think that that a lot of people wish that they had that problem.
Yeah, and see exactly what you said there, though. He was putting in the one overtime shift, but as his income went up over the years, the amount that he saved went up over the years, right?
Yeah,
So not
sure
only
did.
was he saving consistently, he was increasing his amount
Hmm.
consistently. So that's
Right.
exactly what you're supposed to do, right? That is perfect planning, right? Save
So,
consistently and increase what you're saving as often as you can, at the very least when you get a raise, right?
so what you're saying is, Scott, we shouldn't have been laughing at him back then like we were, because everybody
No,
back then was buying new boats and motorcycles.
and I mean that's it, right?
Right.
I'll tell you, if you think about, how much a boat costs today versus the growth of that money over the next 20, 30 years, that was an expensive boat when put
Hmm.
in terms of retirement money, right?
Yeah, and boats depreciate.
Right. So again, we talked about the goals at the beginning. In how do you picture your retirement? What do you want to do, right? What kind of retirement do you want, right? So you're going to have these basic retirement considerations, right? Do I just want to be able to just live comfortably? Do I want to kind of go and travel and pursue, you know, hobbies can get expensive.
They
And
can.
again, you've got
Sure.
more time to do those hobbies when, if your hobby is boating, if your hobby is, fixing up classic cars, whatever your hobby might be, when you have more time to do it, it might get more expensive. So, maybe you want a vacation home, or you want to travel more, spend time with the kids. You have to think about what you want to do in retirement so that you can make sure that you save enough to plan for it.
And one of the wonderful benefits I think about being a law enforcement or first responder who may be able to get a pension and retire early is that you can retire and still be young enough and healthy enough to traverse the world and really enjoy these experiences. And I think that's part of the key of investing early. So you can go out and not have to wait until you're in your 70s before you embark upon your worldwide journey that you may not be fully awake for.
Right.
I mean, that's the reality of it. I think
Yeah.
it's a tough reality, but it's real.
So it's just like what we were saying, right? The earlier that you retire, right, the less time you had to save. So it's important to put a couple of things in here, right? With public sector, they typically have a 457 plan, right, which is different than all the other retirement plans because it's the only one that doesn't have that age minimum, right? With an
Right.
IRA, you have to be 59 and a half to access the money. With a 457, you don't have that rule. It's whenever you separate from your employer, you have access to the funds. So again, I was mentioning the different vehicles that we've got, right? Your employer sponsored plan is probably one of the easiest ones. They're going to take it automatically out of your paycheck. You can make it before taxes. Usually you can do a Roth as well, depending on your employer. But so you can make the decision, do I want my tax break now? Do I want my tax break later? You can do both. I'm going to do $50 in the Roth and $50 in the pre-tax. You can also do individual accounts. Remember, anything other than a 457 is typically going to have that early withdrawal penalty if you're younger than 59 and a half.
I would imagine there's probably somebody out there listening right now that's the light bulb just went on above their head and they said, I've got to go talk to my chief about this.
Right. I mean, again,
Yeah,
it's in the chief's best interest as well to have an
sure
employer
it is.
plan.
Absolutely.
So again, yeah, it's very easy to get those set up, but most employers have them. Again, MissionSquare, that's what we do, right? We're the record keeper for those 457 plans all across the country, and we help keep track of the investments. We help go through, help you get enrolled in the plan, help you make sure that your investments are appropriate for your situation. When you get to retirement, we help you, set up your withdrawals so that you can go and enjoy that money. That's
Mhm.
really what MissionSquare is at its heart. Is that record keeper for public sector retirement plans, which is the 457B.
And is there any cost associated to that agency? Yeah, I would imagine not because there's no employee contribution match. or
Right. And no, there's no cost to the employer
okay,
unless they did a match, but usually they're not going to do the match because they're usually doing a pension, right?
right.
So again, the way that all plans like this work is the investments themselves have investment costs, expense ratios, and
Hmm.
those costs go to pay for the plan. It's just a portion of the investments, right? So you see your average, a mutual fund, the expenses range from very low to, so let's say investments range from under 1% to an expensive one might be, over 1%. But let's just say it was 1%. S&P 500 grew at, 10%. It really grew at 11. The 1%
Hmm.
went to pay the expenses, and then the 10% went to the investors. Like that's kind of how the expenses work. But if it loses money, right? If the market's bad, the market goes down by 10%, well, your account would go down by 11 because that
Hmm.
1%, the expenses come out either way. But that's what pays for the accounts is the internal expenses of the funds in the account. There typically isn't you pay to have this plan. All right. And so again, employer sponsored plans make it so easy. Going back through all the things that we said, making sure that you're understanding your time frame, understanding your risk, investing appropriately, saving as much as you can, and getting all the tax breaks that you can. That's the short version of what we talked about. And then
Right.
the last segment is kind of what about the next generation? What about my family? And we start to talk about the estate planning aspect of it, right? And so the most important thing there is if you don't take any action, right? If you pass away and you don't have a will, you don't have a trust, you don't have anything, well, that's called intestacy, right? You're dying without any instructions. And so if you die without any instructions, who gets to make the decisions? The answer is the state, right? The
Right.
courts,
Probate, right.
probate court, right? So at the very least, you want to have some instructions, right? Now, again, estate planning, fundamentally, we're talking about legal questions, right? So who is going to draw up a will? Who's going to draw up a trust? Not a certified financial planner,
Hmm.
an attorney, right? So you want
Hmm.
to seek out an attorney for advice on these kind of things. But the basics are if you have a will, that's your instructions. Wills are pretty easy to put together. I want this person to get this and that person to get that. However, the will still goes to probate court, and the judge
Right.
is basically, prove probate means to prove, right? They're proving that that's your wishes and making sure that the assets go to who they're supposed to. However, a will can be contested, right? If you look, I can give some examples, but Marilyn Monroe's probate went on for decades with everybody, popping up and saying, hey, I was promised this or I was promised that. Same thing a little more recently with Prince, right? He died
Hmm.
without any paperwork in this regard. But the easiest example I can give is I've got this beautiful classic car and I died without a will. And my mechanic shows up at my probate hearing and said, well, I did all the work on that car. He promised me I could have it when he died. There's
Hmm.
no proof that I didn't say that. And hopefully the judge would say, well, there's no proof that he did, but you never know, right? It is up to the judge. It's not my decision. So if I want it
Right.
to be my decision, a will is good, but a trust is better because with a trust, it doesn't go through probate court. I create, the Eason family trust, and then my assets go into the trust. The trust owns the assets. I
Hmm.
own the trust owns the assets. So I'm in charge of that trust while I'm alive. And if I'm incapacitated or if I pass away, then my successor trustee, probably my spouse, takes over. But there's no change of ownership because the trust is what owns it. The only change is who's running the trust. So
Sure.
therefore, there's no probate court. But
Right. And I
a
think,
trust
I
costs more
think,
than a will, right?
yeah, it does. It does cost more, but I think, what a lot of people don't realize is, even a regular old will can take a year to make its way through probate. And then the probate court takes a percentage of what's there. And I mean, I've heard cases where they're taking 7% of what you have, and that can be significant.
Absolutely. And that's the thing about that. When I say that a trust costs more than a will, it's still going to cost less than the percentage the probate court
Right.
costs. It's just you're paying it up front, right? If I
Hmm.
pay, and again, generally speaking, if you have a very complicated situation, you may pay a couple $1,000s for a trust, but it should be less than that, generally speaking. Um, but so, you pay that 2,000 up front instead of, 2, 5, 7% of the whole estate in probate. That's a huge savings. And again, it's a very seamless process with a trust. And again, the trust pops in for incapacity too.
Ah,
I can put all of my instructions in there if if I get Alzheimer's or if I'm on life support, by going through the estate planning process, it gives you the opportunity to make those decisions in advance. It's not a fun topic. It's not fun to decide and to think about, but you're doing it. You're making the decisions so your
Right.
loved ones don't have to. And
Hmm.
that's really what all this is about, right? You're protecting them. You're making it so they don't have to struggle with would he wanted this, would he have not wanted that. You're doing that for them, which
Hmm.
is, really a blessing for, the spouse and the kids, so they don't have to worry
Absolutely.
about that. Right. So
Agreed.
again, I'll give a quick example of what intestacy laws look like. It depends on the state that you're in, right? One example might be that they give half of the assets to the wife and a quarter to each child. Some of it all goes to the spouse. It really depends. And this also can get complicated when you have like a second marriage and blended families and other kids. And so when you do your will, when you do your trust, it gives you the opportunity to just make it very clear where you want
Hmm.
everything to go. I've talked to a lot of estate planning attorneys, and they basically say, from the lawyer's part, it's pretty much boilerplate legal documents. The hardest part is you deciding who gets what. Like if you sit down with your spouse and you decide, this is what I want, you can do a trust in an afternoon, right? It's making
Hmm.
those decisions that's the important part. And
Sure.
but it's not a fun thing to talk about because you have to talk about you not being around anymore. So that's why a lot of people don't get around to doing them. It's just because it's uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Uh, but a proper estate plan is extremely important to your family once you're gone.
Agreed. Yep. Never too late to get that going for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, the same thing we're talking about incapacity. You never know. I mean, a simple car accident could put you in a coma, and then somebody's got to make the decisions. Or something like Alzheimer's comes along a little more slowly, but by the time you realize it's coming along, sometimes it's too late to do the paperwork, right?
Mhm.
So you want to make sure that you're being aware of those things, especially if you have if some of those things run in the family, you want to take care of them. We talked about long-term care earlier. Your specific situation, your health, your family history, those all matter, and you want to make sure that the plan is right for you. And
Hmm.
and I'm gonna go to the disclaimer page, right? Obviously, Mission Square, we don't give investment advice, we don't give tax advice, we don't give legal advice. We are here for educational purposes to help you understand all these things. But that's what we do, right? We don't charge for our consultation with the CFP. We want to help you understand what your benefits are. And so I want to say that every person is unique. You put together your plan, you follow up on it, you check it. It's just like I said earlier, when you write it down, it goes from a dream to a goal.
Hmm.
But when you write it down, it gives you something that you can measure and you can follow up on, right? Am I on track to get to where I wanted to be? I wanted to retire at 50. Here's how much I should need at that point. I have this many years to go. Am I on track? And so we want to follow up with, updating your plan, talking to your certified financial planner, probably once a year. The closer you get to retirement, the more important the details are. When you're early in the career, save as much as you can, invest appropriately for your time frame, prioritize your goals. As you're getting closer, all these other things become more and more important. The long-term care, the disability insurance, the tax breaks, it gets more and more important as we go along. And at Mission Square, we're here to help you every step of the way, even into and all the way through retirement.
And that's really, I think that's the key and the reason why we're having this discussion today, because I know so many law enforcement officers that this brings them a level of anxiety that they can't get around. And unfortunately, sometimes anxiety leads to paralysis, right? We just freeze and we factor in all the other things that are going on a daily basis. And we've got a mortgage payment and the kids need to go to soccer. And I realize that all those things are incredibly important, but
Yeah.
investing and saving for your future. I mean, as somebody who was that young buck, that boot cop who was that boot state trooper who started out, you never think you're going to get to that point where this even matters, right? Because that's so far away. But I'm so thankful that early on in my career, we had somebody come in to our academy setting and discuss the inherent benefit of investing in the 457. And like I told you before, Scott, offline, I invested a little bit. because at that point, that's really all I could afford. And eventually I continued to grow that and eventually got to a point where there's a comfort that comes along with, and it takes a while. I'm not going to tell you that it doesn't, but it takes a while. But you get to that point where you sort of look at the totality of what you've done with your investment portfolio. And if you've done it well, and if you've gotten some good advice from people like Scott, who are knowledgeable and who have your financial interests at heart, the end result is it's nothing short of magnificent, because then you really get to a point where you feel a comfort in that retirement. No longer are you afraid. And I know many cops who have been afraid to actually take the step to retire because they have not confronted what we've talked about today. Maybe they've saved aggressively, but still there's so many unanswered questions. And I think questions sometimes are what cause us to just push this aside and I'll get to it another day. And that day needs to be today, right? You
Yeah.
talk about planting a tree. What was the best time 30 years ago? I'm glad I started over 30 years ago, but a lot of folks haven't. And I've seen what that leads to. And I know that there are a lot of law enforcement officers right now that are hearing what you're saying and they're ready to take that step, and they should be ready to take that step, because I think there's comfort in that, right? I think, what do they say? Change confounds before it comforts. And I think this is a change. This is a change, especially if you haven't been investing, but it will comfort you down the road if you make those sacrifices now. And that's really what it is. You sacrifice that expensive coffee, or maybe put off that trip to Disney just temporarily, and eventually it's going to come back to you tenfold. But it really is, it's about a commitment. And Scott, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your schedule to really help demystify this and really give people some food for thought, because you've really come at this from so many angles, and that's exactly what I knew you would do. But that's what people need to hear, because cops are so good at so many things, but very few of them are really good at investments. And I don't mean to paint with a broad brush. There are some that will probably send me an email after this and say, "You're crazy. I do this all the time." But I think on whole, this really is something, and I've heard these conversations for years in my career. These little sidebars, people talking about retirement and investing and what that looks like. And I think one question just begs yet another. And you've done an excellent job in peeling back some of the layers of this onion today. I think to really make it easier to understand, make it more digestible, because that's what we want. When we look at officer safety and wellness, we look at the mental health of the men and women that are out there protecting us every day. We want to knock down any obstacles or any barriers that are going to cause them any degree of anxiety. And I know for many, this is high on the list of what causes that. So the fact that we keep coming together, the fact that MissionSquare is so committed to working with first responders and giving them a path for a successful financial future, I can't say enough good about what you're doing, Scott, and what your organization is doing. We really appreciate the partnership that we have and the support that we get from you. And frankly, from my heart, I am very thankful that there's a group like MissionSquare that can really help law enforcement folks prepare for something that can be wonderful if they prepare properly. And if they don't, it will be uncomfortable. And that is not what any of these heroes deserve. They deserve comfort in their retirement. They deserve to have somebody on like you on the other end of the line when they pick up and they've got questions. I just can't thank you enough, Scott.
Oh, again, it's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate it. I know we did this last year, and just like what you said, we talked about mental health, physical health, spiritual health, and financial health, right?
Mhm.
All those things are important. We talked about a lot of stuff over the course of today, and it can feel overwhelming. But the best part of my career is that when you get that officer that's ready to retire, and we go through and all the numbers look good, and they're like, "Wow, I can do what I want. I'm there." That peace of mind is really the best part of my job. When we get to do that. But I've also,
Sure.
I've been spent so much time in briefing rooms and at the academies as that guy going, okay, here's how your 457 works. Here's how you get enrolled. It's like, so I've been through it. I realize when I get to the point where some of the folks that I helped sign up or getting to the point where they're ready to retire. I've seen them
Sure.
go from the academy to promotions to sergeant, and even a couple of captains over the years. It's like time goes by very fast.
Yeah.
But when you're together with your work family, and hey, let's do this together, let's start saving, it really makes a big difference over time. And so I mean, we are happy to support law enforcement. It is a major part. I mean, probably one of the largest audiences that we work with, because we only work with public sector. But I mean, law enforcement is such an important and large part of the public sector workforce. We appreciate being available to them. I'll put up a little QR code if anybody wants to schedule a meeting with a MissionSquare CFP. Again, that's available for MissionSquare participants. We are one of the main record keepers out there, so we look forward to speaking with you. Troy, I can't thank you enough for letting me be here today. I really do appreciate it.
It's been great. And, again, I can't thank you enough. This has really been insightful and I think very thoughtful and thought-provoking for the folks that are listening to this. So I'd like to thank MissionSquare again for being just such a terrific supporter of not only our organization as a whole, but our ambassador program. We could not do this program, and this is a phenomenal program. It's an extension of what we do. They are liaisons in the field, and MissionSquare has been very generous with their support. And until next time, my name is Troy Anderson. Thank you so much for listening to Lifeline, and we'll see you again next time. Be safe and be well.